The question is not whether a woman died in Minneapolis. We know she did. The question is what happens after a federal officer pulls the trigger. And whether the law stops at the badge. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And this case forces us to confront something uncomfortable. When power says, this ends here, does it actually end? Vice President J.D. Vance says the officer is protected by absolute immunity. That the case would be thrown out, that there is nothing for a state to do. But law is rarely that clean. And justice is almost never that simple, because between what politicians declare and what courts decide, there is a long, contested space, a space filled with judges, with evidence, with video, with questions about what was known in a single, irreversible moment. If you care about accountability in a democracy, this story matters. Stay with me. Because to understand what's really at stake here, we have to slow down and look carefully at the legal ground beneath these claims. At the center of this case is a claim that sounds definitive, almost comforting in its certainty, that a federal officer enforcing federal law cannot be touched by a state prosecutor. It frames the issue as jurisdictional, federal versus state, Washington versus Minnesota. But that framing hides the real question. The issue is not whether the officer worked for the federal government. Everyone agrees on that. The issue is whether any action taken under color of federal authority is automatically shielded from criminal scrutiny. That distinction matters because American law was built on a suspicion of unchecked power. Even well-intentioned power, especially armed power. Legal experts point out something crucial. There is no switch labeled absolute immunity that flips on the moment a badge is shown. Instead, the law asks harder questions, slower questions, questions courts, not politicians, must answer. Was the officer acting within official duties? And more importantly, was the action objectively reasonable in that exact moment? Those questions don't end debate. They begin it, and to see why this standard exists at all, we have to go back to the history that created it. To understand why immunity is not automatic, you have to step back into history. More than a century of case law sits behind this moment. Cases built around a simple fear that federal power, left unchecked, could swallow state authority entirely. This is where something called supremacy clause immunity enters the picture. Not as a shield, but as a test. Federal officers were never meant to be above the law. They were meant to be protected only when acting lawfully and reasonably in pursuit of their duties. That balance is deliberate. It preserves federal authority without erasing local accountability. Courts have repeated this logic for decades. Again and again, a state may bring charges. A federal officer may respond, and a judge must decide where the line is. Not in theory, but in facts. What happened, what was seen, what was known in the seconds before a trigger was pulled. That is why this system moves slowly, why it demands evidence, and why no politician can close the case with a sentence. And now, with that legal foundation in mind, the first real pressure point appears, the moment where theory collides with violence. Then comes the moment that shatters abstraction. A woman sits in the driver's seat of her car. Her name is Renee Nicole Good. She is 37 years old. An ICE officer fires. She dies at the scene. Almost immediately, two stories begin to form. Federal authorities describe her as a rioter, as someone obstructing officers, as a threat who attempted to use her vehicle as a weapon. That language matters because it frames everything that follows, but video complicates that frame. 3 separate recordings reviewed later do not deliver a single clean narrative. They introduce ambiguity, movement without context, seconds that can be read more than one way. This is where the legal battle truly begins. Because immunity does not turn on slogans. It turns on reasonableness. What did the officer perceive? What options existed in that moment? What would a reasonable officer have done with the same information in the same seconds? Those questions are not political. They are forensic, and once a life is lost, there is no way to answer them casually. But just as those questions surface, another crisis emerges, one that threatens to decide the outcome before any court ever does. What decides these cases is rarely a single law. It is a process. And that process has a hidden center of gravity. Evidence. If a state brings charges against a federal officer, the officer has a powerful move available. The case can be removed to federal court. There, a judge conducts a two-part analysis. Structured, methodical, unforgiving. First, was the officer acting within the scope of official duties? That bar is low. Most officers clear it. But the second question is where everything turns. Was the action objectively reasonable, based on the totality of circumstances, known to the officer at that precise moment? This is not speculation. It is reconstruction, video footage, witness statements, angles, timing, commands heard or missed, seconds slowed down until meaning is extracted. At every step, reasonableness is reassessed, not from hindsight, but from the scene itself, which means something else becomes decisive. Who controls the evidence? Who has access and who does not? And in this case, that question explodes into the open. If you are listening to this, you are not a lawyer. You are not a judge. You are a citizen, and that matters because when a shooting like this happens, the consequences do not stay inside courtrooms. They reach into daily life. If a state cannot fully investigate a death within its borders, what message does that send to you? Local investigators in Minnesota say they were blocked, prevented from accessing evidence, shut out of a process meant to determine truth. Without full access, they say they cannot meet the standards the public expects. And when transparency collapses, trust goes with it. You begin to wonder whether accountability is conditional, whether justice depends on who holds the badge, whether some cases are decided before facts are even gathered. This is not abstract. It shapes how safe you feel, how protected you feel, how equal the law feels. If you believe accountability matters, this is the moment to pay attention. Because what happens next will tell us far more than any statement ever could. And once the local story fractures, the impact does not stop at Minnesota's borders. What begins as a local shooting quickly becomes a national signal because immigration and customs enforcement does not operate in isolation. It sits at the center of a historic deportation campaign, one marked by speed, by scale, and by fierce political pressure. Across the country, protests follow ICE operations, not just against deportations, but against the perception of enforcement without oversight. When a federal agency blocks state investigators, the tension multiplies. States watch closely. So do governors. So do attorneys general. Because the precedent matters. If federal officers are effectively insulated from state scrutiny, then enforcement becomes centralized power without local consent. That alters the balance. The Constitution was designed to protect, and internationally, the image travels even faster. A country that lectures others about rule of law is suddenly questioned on its own transparency. Allies notice, adversaries amplify, the narrative hardens. This is no longer just about one officer or one woman in a car. It is about whether federal force can operate beyond local accountability in the world's most visible democracy. And once that question is asked globally, the future stops being theoretical. It demands scenarios. Now, let's consider the future three possible paths. The first path The best case scenario: courts and investigators fully access the evidence. State charges are carefully considered. A reasonable officer is distinguished from misconduct. Justice is transparent. The public sees accountability, and trust in institutions holds firm. The second path, the middle ground: investigations are partial, evidence limited. Federal courts shield the officer from state prosecution. Public outrage simmers. Trust erodes slowly, unevenly. Politicians make statements, but facts remain contested. The legal system functions, but confidence falters. The third path, worst case scenario: evidence remains inaccessible. Federal immunity becomes effectively absolute. Communities feel powerless, protests intensify, the narrative of unequal justice spreads. Accountability becomes symbolic, not real. And the very legitimacy of law enforcement faces a profound crisis. In all scenarios, one truth remains: the law is only as strong as its enforcement, and enforcement is only as credible as its transparency. Every citizen watches, evaluates, and judges. And the system, fragile, complicated, human, responds accordingly. Now, we return to the hard lesson at the heart of this story. In the end, the story is clear and unsettling. A life was lost. A federal officer fired a weapon, and the law, complex and layered, now determines what comes next. Absolute immunity is not a given. Reasonableness is tested. Evidence is decisive. And access to that evidence can shape the entire outcome. For you, the viewer, this is not just legal theory. It is a lesson in the fragility of accountability. It is a reminder that power, unchecked, can become unmoored, and that justice, however well-intentioned, requires vigilance. What happens in Minnesota resonates across states, across institutions, across the very principles that hold society together. So watch closely, question boldly, and remember, the strength of democracy is measured not by the authority it grants, but by the transparency and accountability it enforces. Because the next time a badge meets a citizen, the world will be watching. If you want to understand more about how law, power, and accountability intersect, stay with me for the next analysis. Because these patterns repeat and the stakes remain high.